Heading into the 60s, horror would pivot away from the monster movies of the past. We would focus on the monster within. In 1960, we would get Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which is widely regarded as one of the best psychological thrillers of all time, featuring a knife-wielding killer and many iconic scenes, including one of the best reveals of all time. Peeping Tom would also be released the same year. The film revolves around a serial killer who murders women while using a portable camera to record their dying expressions of terror, putting his footage together into a snuff film used for his own self-pleasure. 3 years later, we would get Blood Feast, which is considered to be the first splatter film. The plot focuses on a psychopathic food caterer who kills women so that he can include their body parts in his meals and perform sacrifices to his Egyptian goddess. The same year, Mario Bava would release The Girl Who Knew Too Much, which is considered to be the first Giallo film. It would include stylish directing, a murder mystery storyline, a beautiful woman in jeopardy, and lots of suspense. But it would lack the high body count and explicit sexuality. That would come 1 year later with Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace. The film would also introduce the standard look for a Giallo killer: a trench coat, gloves, hat, and mask. In 1970, Dario Argento would release The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. It would be the first Giallo to achieve significant commercial and critical success. The early 1970s saw a flood of Giallo films, with filmmakers looking to replicate Dario Argento's success. In 1971, Mario Bava would release A Bay of Blood, which is considered to be Bava's most violent film and would have a profound impact on the slasher subgenre. In 1974, Tobe Hooper would release one of the most disturbing horror films of all time, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The plot follows a group of friends who fall victim to a family of cannibals while on their way to visit an old homestead. The film was marketed as being based on true events to attract a wider audience. The film was incredibly successful, grossing over $30 million in the United States and Canada. The same year, Bob Clark would release Black Christmas. The story follows a group of sorority sisters who receive threatening calls and are eventually stalked and murdered by a mentally ill killer during the Christmas season. The film would keep its killer hidden in the shadows and would rely heavily on POV, atmosphere, and suspense. In 1976, we would get Alice, Sweet Alice. The film focuses on a troubled adolescent girl who becomes a suspect in the brutal murder of her younger sister at her first communion, as well as in a series of unsolved stabbings that follow. The same year, we would get The Town That Dreaded Sundown, loosely based on the 1946 Texarkana Moonlight Murders. The story follows a hooded berserk killer who terrorizes the peaceful town of Texarkana, Arkansas in 1946, leaving no fewer than 5 murder victims in his wake. These films, along with many others, laid the groundwork for slasher films. In 1978, John Carpenter's Halloween would set the formula for slasher films going forward. Just like in Black Christmas and other films before it, Halloween would utilize POV. This would become an essential trope of the slasher subgenre. The film is set in the town of Haddonfield, a peaceful, suburban town. Carpenter didn't pick a spooky location like a haunted mansion for the setting. He picked one that's supposed to be safe and secure. We don't know why Michael snapped and what drives him to kill. It's this unknown evil that is truly frightening. The little information we get about Michael is through a psychiatrist, Dr. Samuel Loomis.
Because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
Carpenter keeps Michael primarily in the shadows. You can hear his breathing throughout the film, which creates a sense of terror that Michael could be anywhere. The teenagers are more worried about sex than watching the kids, which is ultimately their downfall, as they get picked off one by one. The kills have very little blood, similar to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it doesn't need to be overly gory to be effective. Carpenter didn't go over the top with the kills, and he actually leaves it to our imagination, and sometimes our minds can conjure up something far more terrifying. The film introduces one of the most iconic final girls of all time, Laurie Strode. She is babysitting Tommy Doyle and Lindsay Wallace on Halloween night. Normally kids are a safe haven in horror movies, but not this time. Quickly after discovering the dead bodies of her friends, Laurie and the kids find themselves in danger. Laurie fights off the boogeyman the best that she can until Dr. Loomis steps in and shoots Michael 6 times. Just when you think it's safe, Michael is gone, and you hear Carpenter's iconic score kick in. We're left with Laurie crying and Dr. Loomis in shock. We hear Michael's breathing as we revisit locations throughout the film. This once peaceful town is forever haunted by the boogeyman. John Carpenter's Halloween would go on to gross $70 million at the box office, becoming one of the most profitable independent films of all time, thus ushering in the golden era of slashers. Filmmakers would look to capitalize on Halloween's success with holiday-themed slashers. In 1980, we would get Friday the 13th. The plot follows a group of teenage camp counselors who are murdered one by an unknown killer while they're attempting to reopen an abandoned summer camp with a tragic past. The film would not only take inspiration from Halloween, but films like Psycho, with the mother playing a pivotal role in the story. Tom Savini's special effects are top-notch. The film goes even further with the gore and nudity, while having a very memorable ending. While the critical response was divided, the film proved that the slasher formula could once again be successful, grossing over $59 million worldwide. Prom Night. The film's plot follows a group of high school seniors who are targeted at their prom by a masked killer seeking vengeance for the accidental death of a young girl 6 years earlier. Mother's Day. The plot focuses on 3 women that are camping who fall victim to 2 deranged, murderous young men and their unhinged mother. Jamie Lee Curtis would be back again with Terror Train. The film follows a group of pre-medical school students holding a New Year's Eve costume party on a moving train who are targeted by a killer who dons their costumes. Motel Hell. The plot follows farmer, butcher, motel manager, and meat entrepreneur Vincent Smith, who traps travelers and harvests them for his human sausages. Christmas Evil. The plot follows a deranged man obsessed with Santa Claus, who eventually goes on a murderous rampage dressed in a Santa Claus suit. New Year's Evil. The plot follows a Los Angeles punk rock and new wave show host who receives a series of phone calls during a televised New Year's Eve bash from a killer warning of impending murders that he plans to exact as the new year dawns on each time zone. To close out 1980, we got Maniac. Italian-American landlord Frank Zito was abused as a child by his prostitute mother Carmen, and as a result becomes a serial killer who murders young women, scalps them, and attaches their hair to mannequins. 1981 is widely considered the best year for slasher films, and would kick off with My Bloody Valentine. The plot follows a group of young adults who decide to throw a Valentine's Day party only to incur the vengeful wrath of a maniac in minor gear who begins a killing spree. It was considered a box office disappointment by Paramount Pictures, as it did not reach the levels of Friday the 13th in terms of profit, but would go on to become a fan favorite slasher. The Funhouse. The plot follows four teenagers who become trapped in a dark ride at a local carnival in Iowa and are stalked by a mentally disabled, murderous carny. Bloody Birthday. The plot follows a group of children born on the same day during a solar eclipse who begin committing murders on their 10th birthdays. Friday the 13th, Part 2. 5 years after the massacre at Camp Crystal Lake, a group of counselors at a nearby summer camp decide to explore the area and start dropping off one by one. The film marks the debut of Jason Voorhees as the series' main antagonist. His appearance closely resembles the Elephant Man and the Phantom from The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Even though Tom Savini did not return to do the special effects, the kills still deliver, with one of the kills obviously inspired by Mario Bava's A Bay of Blood. While not as successful as the original, Part 2 would gross $21 million. Graduation Day. The plot follows a high school track team who are stalked and murdered by a masked assailant days before their graduation. With a budget of $250,000, the film would gross $23.9 million. The Burning. The plot follows a summer camp caretaker who was horribly burnt from a prank gone wrong, where he seeks vengeance at a nearby summer camp years later. The MPAA gave in to the critical reception and reaction of pressure groups who were protesting the films in the wake of violent acts such as the assassination of John Lennon and the growing debate about violence in the media. The Burning was heavily trimmed to receive its R rating. Nowadays we see it in its uncut glory, and the special effects by Tom Savini are some of the best of any slasher film. Happy Birthday to Me. The plot revolves around 6 brutal murders occurring around a popular high school senior's birthday. Final Exam. The plot follows a nameless killer stalking the remaining group of students left on a college campus days before the beginning of summer vacation. Hell Night. The film depicts a night of fraternity hazing set in an old manor, the site of a familial mass murder, during which a deformed killer terrorizes and murders many of the college students. Don't Go in the Woods. The film follows 4 campers confronted by a murderous woodsman slaying hikers on a wooded mountainside. Nightmare. The plot follows a deranged man with the intent on murdering his ex-wife and child. Halloween 2. The plot picks up directly after the cliffhanger ending of the first film, with Michael Myers following survivor Laurie Strode to the local hospital, while his psychiatrist Dr. Loomis continues his pursuit of him. The film introduced the fact that Michael and Laurie were siblings, something that Carpenter apparently wrote while he was drunk. To keep up with the slasher films of the 80s, Halloween 2 features more gore and a higher body count than the original. Halloween 2 is often regarded as one of the better sequels and works well as a double feature with the original. Madman. The plot focuses on an axe-wielding murderer named Madman Mars, who, after accidentally being summoned by a group of campers during a campfire tale, begins to stalk and murder the young adults. The Prowler. The film follows a group of college students in a coastal California town who are stalked and murdered during a graduation party by an apparent World War II veteran who killed his ex-girlfriend in 1945. The kills in The Prowler are nothing short of fantastic. Tom Savini would deliver a great showcase of special effects with the kills. Just Before Dawn. The film follows a group of hikers who travel into a mountainous region of Oregon to visit property inherited by one of them, only to be hunted down by a ruthless backwoods killer. 1982. The Dorm that drip blood. It follows 4 college students who stay on campus over the Christmas holiday to clean out the condemned dormitory, where an unknown assailant began stalking and murdering them. Death Valley. A mother and her child are being stalked by a serial killer after the boy picks up an object that can help tie the killer to his crimes. Death Screams. A machete-wielding maniac stalks a group of unsuspecting students, ensuring that no one leaves this gore fest alive. The Forest. 2 couples plan a trip into the forest, but they didn't count on a killer on the loose with a taste for human flesh. Friday the 13th, Part 3. The plot follows a teenage girl and her friends who go on a trip to a house near Crystal Lake, where a wounded Jason Voorhees has taken refuge, until re-emerging for another killing spree. The film marks the first appearance of Jason's signature hockey mask, which has since become a trademark of both the character and the franchise. Pieces. The plot follows an unknown assailant killing female students at a college campus in Boston, who uses their body parts to make a human jigsaw puzzle. The Slayer. 2 couples who, upon visiting the island, get trapped there due to an oncoming hurricane, as one of the women knows from her plaguing nightmares that the island is dangerous. Over the next 3 days, they begin to be killed by something unseen. Deadly Games. The plot follows a small town terrorized by a ski-masked serial murderer targeting young women. Trick or Treats. The plot focuses on an escaped psychiatric patient who attempts to track his young son on Halloween night. Alone in the Dark. The plot follows a psychiatrist's family who are besieged by 4 escaped mental patients during a power blackout. Closing out in 1982, we would get The Slumber Party Massacre. The film follows a high school senior who gathers her friends for a slumber party, unaware that an escaped power drill-wielding killer is loose in the neighborhood. 1983 would kick off with The House on Sorority Row. The plot follows a group of sorority sisters being stalked and murdered during their graduation party after they conceal a fatal prank against their house mother. Curtains. The plot focuses on a group of ambitious female performers who are targeted by a masked killer while auditioning for a film role at a prestigious director's mansion. Mortuary. It follows a young woman who, while investigating the death of her father, exposes disturbing secrets surrounding a local mortuary. Sweet 16. The film follows a teenage girl who moves to a small Texas town, after which a series of brutal murders plague the young men there. The Final Terror. The story follows a group of campers in the Northern California wilderness who are forced to fight for their lives against a backwoods feral killer, hunting them down as prey. The Prey. It follows a group of campers in the Rocky Mountains who are stalked and murdered by a disfigured assailant. To close out 1983, we would get Sleepaway Camp. 8 years after a horrific speedboat accident, Ricky and Angela go to Camp Arawak for the summer, but things take a quick turn as campers and staff get picked off one by one. The film is unintentionally funny at times, has some really good special effects, and has an ending that will leave you speechless. 1984 would be considered the last year in the golden era of slasher films. And to kick it off, we would get Friday the 13th, Part 4, the final chapter. Picking up immediately after the events of the previous film, the plot follows a presumed dead Jason Voorhees, who escapes from the morgue and returns to Crystal Lake to continue his killing spree. The film marks the debut of the character Tommy Jarvis, played by Corey Feldman. This was set to be the final Friday the 13th film, and makeup artist Tom Savini, who worked on the first film, returned because he wanted to help kill off Jason, whom he helped create. And he would be successful at that. At the film's climax, a young Tommy Jarvis would kill Jason Voorhees. The Initiation. The plot focuses on a young woman plagued by a disturbing recurring nightmare who finds herself and her fellow sorority pledges stalked by a killer during their initiation ritual in a department store after hours. Fatal Games. The film follows a mad slasher wielding a javelin, killing off members of the high school gymnastics team. Splatter University. A young psychology teacher is sent to a private college as a replacement for a teacher who was recently murdered by an escaped mental patient. The new teacher must protect herself and her students from this deranged serial killer. The Mutilator. The plot follows a group of college students who travel to an island property during fall break and are stalked and murdered by one of the students' fathers. Silent Madness. A criminally insane man is accidentally released from the mental hospital. The staff tries to cover it up, but a young psychiatrist travels to the college town where he committed several murders to warn the locals and anticipate his arrival. Silent Night, Deadly Night. The film follows a young man named Billy who suffers from post-traumatic stress over witnessing his parents' murder on Christmas Eve by a man disguised as Santa. In adulthood, the Christmas holiday leads him into a psychological breakdown, and he emerges as a spree killer donning a Santa suit. Silent Night, Deadly Night was one of the most controversial films of the 1980s due to its advertising campaign, particularly its poster and TV spots that made significant emphasis on the killer being dressed as Santa Claus. The PTA fought to have this film removed from the theaters due to its subject matter and the fact that it was shown around Christmas. Although an earlier film with a similar premise, Christmas Evil, had gone unnoticed. With the death of an icon, another would be born in Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street. The plot follows a group of teenagers who are targeted by Krueger, an undead child killer who can murder people through their dreams, as retribution against their parents who burned him alive. The film would feature Johnny Depp in his film debut. The film would be incredibly inventive with its death scenes and would give us a great final girl in Nancy Thompson, played by Heather Langenkamp. Robert Englund would play Freddy Krueger, a diabolical killer who took pleasure in causing his victims torment. The film was incredibly successful. With a budget of $1.1 million, it would gross over $57 million worldwide, leading New Line Cinema to become a successful mini-major film studio and earning it the nickname The House That Freddy Built. Freddy Krueger would help close out the golden era of slasher films. The box office battle between the Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street franchise would begin in 1985, with Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, grossing $21.9 million on a $2.2 million budget. Freddy's Revenge would release in November, grossing $30 million on a $3 million budget. In 1986, Jason Lives would gross $19.5 million on a $3 million budget. In 1987, A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, Dream Warriors, would gross $44.8 million on a $4 million budget. In 1988, Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, would gross $19.2 million on a $2.8 million budget. Following that would be A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4, The Dream Master, which would gross $49.4 million on a $6.5 million budget, making it the 19th highest grossing film of 1988. Even the Halloween franchise would re-emerge in 1988 after a failed attempt to take the series in a different direction. Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, would gross $17.8 million on a $5 million budget. As the 80s were nearing the end, in 1989, we would get Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, which would gross $14.3 million on a $5 million budget, followed by Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, The Dream Child, which would gross $22.1 million on an $8 million budget. Halloween 5: The Revenge of Michael Myers was released in October and would gross $11.6 million on a $5.5 million budget. The MPAA would heavily cut the films. They would be considered disappointments critically and financially. Horror icons Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees were now a shell of their former selves, ending the decade in a whimper. As we moved into the 90s, Jason would go to hell, Freddy would be killed off in Freddy's Dead, and Halloween 6 would have Michael controlled by a cult. With the slasher genre at an all-time low, one film was about to change that. In 1996, we would get Scream, written by Kevin Williamson and directed by Wes Craven. The film would open up with Casey Becker, played by Drew Barrymore, who was originally cast as the film's lead. She would receive a phone call from a stranger. The man on the phone would test her knowledge of the horror genre in a sick and twisted game that would cost Casey her life. Having a star actress such as Drew Barrymore die in the opening scene not only paid homage to Psycho, but would set the tone going forward that anything could happen in this film. Scream mocks and embraces classic slasher tropes. The characters in Scream have in fact seen horror films. Film geek Randy Meeks explains the rules of horror movies at a party, with one of them being that the final girl must be a virgin to defeat the killer. We see Randy watching Halloween and demanding that Laurie Strode turns around to face the killer, while Ghostface is behind him. Ghostface wouldn't be an undead zombie slasher or a dream demon. Ghostface was an average human who could be hurt. He would chase his victims relentlessly throughout the film. Everyone is a suspect. The audience is kept guessing about the identity of the killer until the shocking reveal that there are two killers, Billy Loomis and Stu Macher. Loomis being the boyfriend of Sidney Prescott, who took her virginity, adding another layer of torment. Sidney would prove that you didn't have to be a virgin to survive a horror movie. At the end of Scream, the killers are defeated. Dewey survives, and Gale Weathers is reporting the events that transpired. Scream would be an absolute box office hit, grossing $173 million on a $15 million budget, with films releasing in the wake of Scream's success, such as I Know What You Did Last Summer, Scream 2, Urban Legend, and even the Halloween franchise with Halloween H2O. Scream would go on to revitalize the slasher genre in the 90s.